enjoy your cake. So, enjoy.
Happy birthday. L'chaim. I saw an interesting thing happen today. A rebel was being arrested by the military police. And rather than be taken alive, he exploded a grenade he had hidden in his jacket. He killed himself, and he took a captain of the command with him. Right, Johnny?
Those rebels know they're lunatics.
Maybe so. But it occurred to me, the soldiers are paid to fight. The rebels aren't.
What does that tell you?
They can win.
This country has had rebels for the last 50 years. It's in their blood, believe me, I know. I've been coming here since the 20s. We were running molasses out of Havana when you were a baby. The trucks owned by your father. Michael. I'd rather we talked about this when we were alone.
In October 1957, Albert Anastasia, a longtime associate of Meyer Lansky, was brutally murdered, sending shockwaves through the world of organized crime. In response, a major summit was hastily arranged at Joe Barbera's property. However, the meeting ended in disaster when law enforcement raided the gathering. Fortunately for Meyer Lansky, he was far from the ill-fated meeting. Suffering from chronic stomach ulcers, he was battling serious health issues that would plague him for the rest of his life. Despite his absence, Lansky's name was inevitably dragged into the ensuing investigation, placing him squarely in the authorities' crosshairs. Determined to stay out of America's legal grasp, Lansky tried to avoid returning to the country. Yet his worsening health and pressing concerns over his casino operations ultimately forced his return to U.S. soil. Meyer Lansky's arrival at Idlewild Airport on the icy, snow-swept evening of February 11th, 1958, marked the beginning of a long night in police custody. Detectives, relentless in their pursuit, trailed his taxi through the slushy streets of New York City. When Lansky stepped out at the bustling corner of 53rd Street and Broadway, they closed in, swiftly placing him under arrest. At the West 54th Street police station, they grilled him for 3 relentless hours, prying for anything that could link him to the underworld machinations swirling around the city. But Lansky, ever the master of measured responses, remained stone-faced. When asked what he did for a living, he simply replied, "Business." Pressed further, he added coldly, "My business." With no real grounds for detention, the frustrated detectives resorted to an old police trick, charging him with vagrancy, a catch-all offence that allowed them to search his belongings. But their combing yielded nothing. No clues, no hidden messages, not even a suspicious receipt. The press, hungry for a scoop on the man they suspected knew more than he let on about Albert Anastasia's recent brutal barbershop murder, fared no better. One daring reporter called out, "What do you know about the killing in the barbershop?" Lansky didn't miss a beat. "As much as an Eskimo in Alaska," he shot back, before disappearing into a waiting car with his lawyer, Moses Polakoff, bound for the upscale Hotel Navarro on Central Park South. The police refused to let Lansky vanish into the Manhattan night. Detectives William Graff and Edward O'Connor were assigned to tail him as he navigated the city's maze of streets, hoping to catch even a glimmer of evidence tying him to Anastasia's execution. Instead, they compiled a dossier that read more like the diary of a mild-mannered retiree than a feared underworld strategist. Lansky visited bookstores like Brentano's and Barnes & Noble, his fingers grazing the spines of hardcovers. He stopped by his doctor's office, then his lawyer's. He dined at unassuming mid-tier restaurants, Dinty Moore's, The Forum, and Billy Guan's, places far removed from the glittering lounges of the Riviera in Havana. He even shopped for kitchen gear at Hofritz Cutlery, inspecting chefs' knives with surprising intensity. One icy Sunday, Detective Graff's surveillance team found temporary relief inside the warm lobby of the Hotel Navarro. The snowstorm outside howled as Graff, soaked and freezing, collapsed onto a sofa, his shoes dripping onto the carpet. He was thawing out when Lansky himself strolled into the lobby, leaned against the front desk, and whispered conspiratorially with the clerk, glancing occasionally in Graf's direction. Before Graf could react, Lansky turned and walked straight toward him, his steps deliberate, purposeful. The young detective froze, his training offering no guidance on what to do when the subject of a major homicide investigation chose to sit down right beside you. Lansky settled into the sofa with a soft groan, rubbing his stomach as though in pain. He didn't bother with introductions. "My ulcers are killing me," he complained, grimacing as if seeking sympathy. For a long moment they sat there in silence, side by side, the relentless pursuer and the uncatchable prey, while the snow outside continued its merciless assault. Finally, Lansky spoke again, his voice low, almost confessional. "I've got something on my mind." Graf tensed. Was this it? A confession? A breakthrough? Lansky exhaled slowly. "It's the chickens." The young detective blinked, certain he'd misheard. "The chickens," Lansky repeated. "You can't get good chickens in Havana." For the next 10 minutes, the reputed financial wizard of organized crime launched into an impassioned monologue about the impossibility of sourcing decent poultry in Cuba. Beef? No problem. The Riviera served excellent steaks. Seafood? Plentiful. Even lamb could be procured without much hassle. But chickens? Forget it. Cuban farmers just couldn't deliver plump, fresh birds in large quantities. "That's why I'm here," Lansky explained with a straight face. "To arrange for a steady supply of good chickens. By air." He paused, rubbing his stomach again. "And to see my doctor about these ulcers, of course." Detective Graf sat speechless, trapped between bewilderment and reluctant admiration for the man who could turn even a mundane gripe into an inscrutable riddle. Lansky rose, adjusted his jacket, and walked back toward the front desk, leaving Graf in stunned silence, still wondering if he'd just been outplayed, or if Meyer Lansky really did just want better chickens. William Graf remained seated next to Meyer Lansky for nearly half an hour, enduring a surreal conversation about poultry logistics and Riviera kitchen woes. The young detective's mind raced, searching for a way to steer the discussion toward something more relevant, something that could break the stalemate surrounding Albert Anastasia's barbershop assassination. But Lansky was inscrutable, talking about meat suppliers with the same gravity others might reserve for state secrets. "He was playing with me," Graf admitted years later, his tone tinged with reluctant admiration. He never filed a formal report about the encounter. What could he have written? That Lansky's ulcers were acting up and Havana's chicken supply chain was subpar. It would have been a farce. As the months rolled on, detectives like Graf reconsidered their assumptions about Lansky's New York visit in February 1958. Theories of sinister intent dissolved into something far more mundane. Hilton hotels, eager to avoid ties to organized crime, opened their records for inspection amid Cuba's high-stakes gambling scene. 13 syndicates vied for the Havana Hilton casino lease, offering $1 million up front for a shot at $3 million in annual profits. President Batista endorsed Roberto Chiri Mendoza, a respected Cuban businessman from a prominent family. Mendoza's ties to Cuba's top baseball team and backing from the Cuban Hotel and Restaurant Workers Union secured his selection. Though Lansky dominated Havana's gaming world, even insiders confirmed he had no stake in the Hilton deal. His Riviera casino was already a goldmine, while other American-run hotspots like the National, San Souci, and Capri thrived. Batista insisted, "This one's for the Cubans." In October 1957, Mendoza flew to New York after gambler Joe Rivers pitched hiring Yankee legend Joe DiMaggio as the Hilton's celebrity host. DiMaggio declined, unwilling to endorse gambling. Rivers pivoted, introducing Mafia boss Albert Anastasia, who proposed a partnership leveraging his union clout. Anastasia's power over New York's hotel and restaurant unions was unmistakable. At a New York lunch, he asked a head waiter, "Can the boss fire you?" "No," the waiter replied. "Because of the union." Anastasia smirked, handing over $10, a tip or a message. When New York police investigated Anastasia's barbershop murder, they desperately tried to link Meyer and Albert through the Hilton Casino, but found no link to Lansky or Cuban gambling. The real motive lay in Anastasia's New York rackets, jukebox schemes, union disputes, and territorial clashes that earned him powerful enemies. Meyer Lansky walked into Manhattan Arrest Court on February 27, 1958, wearing the same unshakable calm he'd worn through every police interrogation, arrest, and courtroom appearance for the past 30 years. He was charged with vagrancy, a petty, desperate accusation that underscored how badly the police wanted to keep him in their grasp. His lawyer, Moses Polikoff, was ready for war. He rose from his seat with the confidence of a man wielding an ironclad case. His voice rang out, slicing through the courtroom air as he laid out the facts. His client had arrived in New York with a paid airline ticket, luggage, a hotel reservation, a checkbook, and $1,085 in cash tucked neatly into his pocket. Hardly the profile of a vagrant. If the police had bothered to check, Polikoff thundered, they would have found Lansky owned respectable homes in Florida and Cuba and had $35,000 sitting in the bank. "Everyone knows this man is not a vagrant," he snapped, daring anyone in the room to say otherwise. Magistrate Reuben Levy barely needed to deliberate. "Under our form of government," he declared, "possible social undesirability is not the equivalent of lawlessness." The police, he ruled, had failed to prove any of the basic elements of the crime. No lack of funds, no lack of job, and no lack of home. "Dismissed." Meyer Lansky strolled out of the courtroom without a scratch, the very picture of untouchable composure. While New York law enforcement's case collapsed, Havana thrived in a dazzling winter season of 1958. Tourists and gamblers poured into Cuba's glittering casinos, leaving fortunes on its gaming tables. At the newly opened Capri Hotel, Miami hotelier, J. "Skip!" Shepard marveled at the profits. The sheer naked profit was unbelievable, he later recalled. Yet even the Capri couldn't rival Meyer Lansky's Riviera, the crown jewel of Havana's casino empire. The world's wealthiest played deep into the night, their fortunes rising and falling with each spin of the roulette wheel. By dawn, Dan "Dusty" Peters discreetly gathered checks and flew to Miami, ensuring funds cleared by noon. He returned to Havana by sunset, ready to restart the cycle. If a check bounced, a rare event, Norberto Peña, a Cuban operative, would make a single polite call. That was usually enough. The delinquent player, realizing their exclusive access was at risk, would pay promptly. Peña never needed to raise his voice. He never failed to collect. Debt collection at the Riviera was an art of psychological mastery. Credit was extended only when repayment was certain, verified by watchful hosts like Peters, who tracked every move with precision. Every chip counted. Every debt was settled. Lansky's empire thrived on unyielding discipline. The casino's efficiency extended beyond the floor. Staff were managed through a network of payoffs, ensuring smooth operations. Critics, like columnist Diego Gonzalez, quickly found themselves on monthly retainers. Lansky believed money could solve any issue, until the corrosive power of cash revealed deeper cracks. Lansky's famed croupier school attracted university graduates, lured by steady wages and tips. Professionals abandoned their trades for casino jobs, a stark symbol of Cuba's inequality. Though Lansky kept the Riviera free from Havana's darkest vices, seedy dens like Casa Marina thrived nearby, catering to the worst impulses of wealthy tourists. Blind to the social decay beneath Batista's rule, Lansky focused solely on profit, unaware or willfully indifferent to the political time bomb ticking beneath his empire. By 1958, Santo Trafficante Jr. reigned over Havana's neon-lit underworld, a casino mogul with influence stretching from backroom deals to glamorous dance halls. He controlled 5 of the city's top casinos: the Capri, Comodoro, Deauville, Sevilla Biltmore, and the iconic Sans Souci nightclub. European-sounding names lent his gritty empire a sheen of sophistication. Yet even empires have limits. Trafficante's deep investments strained his finances. Desperate for capital, he sought $2 million from Albert Anastasia for a lease on the Havana Hilton's casino. The deal collapsed when Batista's cronies awarded the lease to a Cuban millionaire. Unshaken, Santo shrugged off the setback, calling himself a gambler despite despising the act. "I know the odds. You can't beat the house," he'd say with a knowing grin. Frank Regano's first night in Havana was an initiation into Santo's empire. The Sans Souci, Trafficante's favorite, pulsed with life, a heady blend of music, booze, and desire. Santo confidently guided Frank backstage through dim corridors to the dancers' dressing rooms, where performers greeted them casually, the male dancers covering up self-consciously. Santo smirked. "They're queers," he said bluntly. "They won't show themselves to straight men." From there, they entered the casino's counting room, the beating heart of the operation. Santo unlocked the door himself, revealing a sweltering 12 by 12 room stacked with crisp US dollars. 2 men worked in intense silence, one scribbling figures into a ledger, the other punching keys on an adding machine. "That's Henry from Tampa," Santo noted. "He keeps the count straight. You can't trust these Cubans. They'll rob you blind." Trust was a currency he spent sparingly. Later, as dawn painted the streets, they spotted a familiar figure, a bagman delivering cash to Batista's wife, who skimmed 10% off Santo's slot machine profits. "You pay for everything in Havana," Santo remarked coolly, treating corruption like the air he breathed. Regano marveled at Trafficante's empire, but couldn't resist asking why he didn't try running legitimate businesses back home. Santo's response was sharp. "A man blind in one eye has plenty of vision among the blind." In Cuba's anything-goes atmosphere, even a mob boss could feel like a king. Havana itself was intoxicating, a fever dream of elegance and vice. Its sultry nights burned with neon light and pulsed with mambo and jazz. The Sans Souci stood at the heart of it all, an oasis of sin where music played non-stop under tropical skies. Dancers, adorned in sparkling costumes, dazzled crowds, blending spectacle and seduction. Sex wasn't just entertainment. It was commerce. Some motels rented rooms by the quarter hour, a scandalous service yet to catch on in the US discreet high walls shielded the cars of lovers, ensuring privacy in indulgence. Santo found Regano's wonder amusing. "You've got a lot to see," he'd smirk, leading him deeper into Havana's secret pleasures. For Regano, the city was a transformation, a place where right and wrong blurred under neon lights. Through Santo, Regano mingled with Havana's elite, including Alfredo, a socialite with a near-mythic reputation. Alfredo owned luxurious villas for each mistress and hosted extravagant parties where money, women, and power flowed without end. One wild night, Regano foolishly tried to match Alfredo drink for drink at the Sans Souci. Alfredo, decades older but energized by hidden reserves, danced with relentless stamina. Regano struggled, feeling the room spin. Santo arrived just in time, smirking at his drunken state. "I tried keeping up with Alfredo," Regano confessed. Santo led him to the men's room and unlocked a concealed door behind the sinks, revealing a secret wall of safety deposit boxes. "These rich Cubans keep their private stashes of cocaine here," Santo explained casually. "Alfredo's been dosing himself all night. He'll party for 2 or 3 more days." The vault's stark reality hit Regano hard. Santo's dismissive tone couldn't erase the image of those cocaine-filled boxes in his club. The whispers of Trafficante as a drug kingpin felt less like rumor and more like chilling possibility. Yet in all his time around Santo, Regano had seen only hints, just enough to keep the legend alive. By late 1958, Santo Trafficante Jr. pursued a new casino venture, offering private shares at $25,000 per ownership point. "Buy a few points," he urged Frank Regano. "You'll get rich fast." Back home, Regano's wife, Betty, was skeptical. "Hasn't Santo heard about that revolutionary Castro?" she asked. "He's trying to take over Cuba." Regano relayed her concerns, but Santo dismissed them with a sneer. To him, Castro was a scruffy nuisance, a mosquito bite on Batista's empire. Still ever the strategist, Trafficante hedged his bets by discreetly funding both Batista's government and Castro's rebels. "I'm sure Fidel Castro will never amount to anything," he scoffed. "But even if he does, they'll never close the casinos. There's too much money here for everybody." Batista, however, was crumbling under corruption. His feared military intelligence agency, SIM, ruled through terror. Bodies hung from trees, and dissidents vanished. While foreign investors thrived, Cuba's underclass suffered in grinding poverty. The rot became undeniable one October night in 1956, when Colonel Antonio Blanco Rico, SIM's brutal chief, was assassinated inside the Montmartre Club, a chilling omen of the revolution's unstoppable tide. By the time Fidel Castro landed his ragtag band of revolutionaries in Oriente province that December, just weeks before construction crews broke ground on the Riviera Hotel, his name was already gaining traction. In the smoky backrooms of Havana and the remote jungles of Cuba's interior, the young radical's legend was growing, feeding on the very desperation and inequality that men like Lansky never thought to fear. Havana sparkled defiantly beneath festive lights, masking the storm brewing on the horizon. The sultry air made snow a distant fantasy, but Christmas spirit burned brightly. El Encanto promised Nordic pines for 85 cents a foot, while Lionel trains gleamed in shop windows, sold at Miami prices. Street Santas rang bells, with worn gloves, collecting centavos for the Salvation Army, as holiday cheer pulsed through the city's veins. New Year's Eve loomed with electric anticipation. Despite whispers of rebellion and dwindling tourists, Havana's iconic hotels thrummed with life. At the Grand Riviera Hotel, Meyer Lansky's empire glittered undisturbed, on the surface. Inside its opulent restaurant, diners like Ralph Rubio sensed something darker. Lieutenant Colonel Esteban Ventura arrived with his security detail, their .45 caliber pistols ominously visible, a grim reminder that Havana's nights were no longer safe. Meanwhile, Lansky, officially indisposed due to ulcers, orchestrated a clandestine rendezvous. Leaving a discreet meeting at Joe Stassi's residence, he commanded his driver, "Let's pick up the women. Dinner at the plaza." His companions, Mistress Carmen, his driver's girlfriend Yolanda, and the ever-watchful Armando Jaime, gathered at the historic Plaza Hotel, far from the glitz of the Riviera or Tropicana. The city buzzed with uneasy celebration. Rumors of advancing rebels painted a grim future. Over dinner, Lansky sat composed but distant, shadows of revolution playing behind his sharp eyes. "The Barbudos are close to winning the war," he had confided earlier, a rare admission from the stoic mob boss. As midnight struck and Havana roared into the new year, Lansky remained still, as if sensing fate's icy hand closing in. Jaime was on the dance floor with his girlfriend when, around 1:30 in the morning, he noticed Charles White entering the bar. White scanned the room before striding purposefully toward Lansky's booth. Jaime recognized White as an important figure in the Havana mob. On past trips to the Dominican Republic, White had always been the man out front, managing the Casino de Capri and other mob-connected gambling operations. He was a man whose words carried weight. White leaned down and whispered something into Lansky's ear. Whatever he said, Lansky received the news with absolute tranquility. Rising smoothly, Lansky signaled Jaime to follow as he and White made their way toward the exit. "Stay here with Carmen," Jaime instructed Yolanda. "I'll be right back." He left Yolanda with Lansky's mistress, who was now seated with the Plaza Casino's manager. Jaime trailed Lansky and White into the lobby. With a slight motion, Lansky signaled Jaime to keep his distance, as he often did when discussing sensitive matters. The two Americans stepped outside and conferred quietly, standing in the shadows between two columns of the portico along Neptuno Street. Jaime watched from the hotel's entrance. After a few tense moments, White hurried off to find his car, while Lansky calmly walked back toward Jaime. "He's gone. The Barbudos have won the war," Lansky stated flatly. The mob boss needed to say no more. Jaime instantly understood who he was: President Batista. The dictator had waited until the entire nation was distracted by New Year's celebrations before fleeing the country under cover of darkness. Jaime was startled by Lansky's reaction. He remained unflappable, more unflappable than ever, more than was usual for him. I never saw him quite that way, not even in the best of circumstances. Lansky turned to his valet. "We better send the women home to Carmen's place. Right now, you and we have a lot of work to do." Carmen's apartment was only 3 minutes away. The four of them, Lansky, Jaime, Carmen and Yolanda, piled into a taxi. After dropping off the women and ensuring they were safely inside, Lansky and Jaime headed back toward the hotel on foot. "We better get moving," Lansky urged. "We have to make the most of what's left of the evening." Upon reaching the plaza, Lansky headed straight for the casino and spoke to the manager. "Batista has abandoned the country," he declared. Lansky issued precise orders. "Take all of the United States currency on the premises, safe deposit boxes, cash reserves, money on the floor, and separate it from the Cuban money. Secure both currencies in something safe. Then, bring it immediately to Joe Stassi's house." The manager nodded and promptly set to work. Turning back to Jaime, Lansky issued his next command. "Get the car," he ordered. "Not the convertible. That's too dangerous. One of the other cars." Jaime understood at once. Lansky now faced the harsh reality that all fallen leaders, corrupt politicians, and toppled dictators eventually confront when the walls close in the end of the line. Power slipping through his fingers, his empire crumbling, he understood that staying put meant risking everything, even his life. His enemies were closing in, and time was no longer an ally. Like countless exiled rulers from volatile regions, Middle Eastern tycoons, deposed Asian generals, Lansky grasped the dark logic of survival. In the brutal game of international power, even Western countries like America and Britain have played host to fleeing oligarchs, provided they came from hostile regimes and carried enough cash or have enough state secrets. Safe havens were a commodity for sale, and Lansky was ready to buy. For decades, fortunes measured in hundreds of billions of dollars, pounds, and euros had flowed into secret accounts in London and New York. The same governments that decried corruption abroad quietly opened their vaults to ill-gotten gains, so long as the money came from adversarial nations and stayed locked in their banks. Lansky was now following this well-trodden path. He gathered whatever assets he could, valuables, cash, anything convertible into power or protection. His mind raced through escape routes, secret locations, stash houses, and loyal contacts. Looting his own empire wasn't betrayal. It was survival. He knew only two things that mattered now: currency and life itself. The first could buy the second, and Lansky wasn't about to waste another second. He would do what Cuban strongman General Batista had done only hours earlier: vanish before his enemies could close the trap. The startling reality is that if this had been a CIA-backed coup d'etat, there would have been a provisional government ready to seize power the moment Batista fled. The rebels would have rallied behind that regime, ensuring a smooth transition. But no such government emerged, signaling that Castro's rise was either outside the CIA's control or only partially supported. This could have been a calculated maneuver by the CIA, designed to provoke a stronger American stance against communism by creating a controllable yet threatening adversary on its doorstep. With Castro in power, the communist threat felt alarmingly close to home, a dangerous but potentially manageable menace. However, someone had armed Castro. His access to weapons bore the unmistakable fingerprints of the Trafficante network, the Central Intelligence Agency, and even Nixon's political operatives. They gambled that Castro would eventually align with their interests. But there was no contingency plan, no alternative government in waiting. The fate of the region hinged on one volatile figure, and he turned out to be the wrong bet. The Havana mob maintained a fleet of vehicles in the garages of their hotel casinos. Lansky's driver retrieved one and picked up Lansky at the plaza's front entrance. "Fast," Lansky urged as he settled into the passenger seat. "Before the people take to the streets. We need to make the rounds to all the casinos and secure the money. First stop is the Sans Souci." It was 3 o'clock in the morning when Jaime and Lansky sped down 51st Avenue toward the Sans Souci nightclub and casino. The streets were eerily deserted. No cars, no pedestrians, no police. Just an ominous, echoing silence. Jaime pressed down on the gas pedal, the speedometer surging past 100 kilometers per hour. They reached the Sans Souci in no time. Both Lansky and his valet entered the bustling casino, making their way towards Santo Trafficante's usual booth. The Tampa mob boss, noticing Lansky's arrival, rose to meet them, his expression unreadable. Apparently, no one at the Sans Souci had yet received word of Batista's sudden departure. Jaime noticed a flicker of tension cross Trafficante's face when Lansky delivered the grim update. Batista was gone. Lansky calmly relayed what he had been told, that the rebels had taken over Las Villas and could reach Havana by the following day. His tone was steady but urgent. "Make the rounds at all of your casinos. Get the money, all of it. Even the cash and checks were held in reserve. Take everything to Stasi's house for safekeeping," Lansky ordered. He added with deliberate emphasis, "The best thing now is to pull back, to be absolutely invisible. Close the casinos, and fast, because at dawn, the crowds will take to the streets, and nothing and nobody will be able to stop them." Trafficante nodded gravely and motioned to someone across the room, issuing silent commands with a flick of his hand. Lansky turned sharply to Jaime. "Let's go," he ordered. "Swing by the Nacional, then onto the Riviera." The two men departed the Sans Souci in haste. Unfortunately for the Havana mob, neither the plaza's manager nor Trafficante fully grasped the urgency of Lansky's warning. Though they secured the cash, they were sluggish about shuttering their establishments. Within hours, both casinos would be ransacked. The Cuban people did not wait until dawn to take to the streets. By 4 o'clock in the morning, news of Batista's flight had begun to spread like wildfire. Initially, people left their homes and gathered spontaneously, cheering, singing, and celebrating. Cars honked their horns, and makeshift percussion instruments, buckets, sticks, and even cymbals added to the raucous symphony. But as the minutes wore on and the full reality of the moment sank in, the jubilant mood shifted toward anger. Years of pent-up frustration erupted into the open. Sporadic clashes broke out between police and rebel militias, who emerged from hiding to begin seizing control of the city. Across from the Plaza Hotel in Parque Central, a fierce shootout ensued between rebel forces and members of Los Tigres, Batista's feared paramilitary enforcers. The Masferistas had taken positions in a building on Manzana de Gomez Street, exchanging relentless gunfire with the rebels below. Bullets shattered balconies and windows on the second and third floors, sending terrified bystanders scrambling for cover. These men would either perish on the streets of Cuba or manage to flee, forming rebel groups in Miami, just as other Cuban exiles had done decades before. Some would return on the day of the Bay of Pigs invasion, determined to reclaim what they felt they had lost. These were fiercely loyal men, devoted to Cuba and fully aware of the threat Castro posed. They were prepared to die standing, fighting for their homeland. In a time when Batista had already fled, these were the last men to stand and fight on behalf of the Cuban people, a testament to their bravery and courage. The raging gun battle across the street from the hotel in Parque Central continued well into the early hours. Decades of corruption and repression had finally ignited an unstoppable fury. One of the first symbols of the Batista regime to be destroyed was the parking meters, emblems of greed and exploitation tied to Batista's brother-in-law, Robert Fernandez Miranda. Everyone knew the meters, like the hated slot machines, funneled money straight into Fernandez Miranda's pockets. Armed with hammers, lead pipes, and baseball bats, enraged citizens smashed the meters to pieces, severing them from their steel posts. While some tried to pry open the shattered devices to retrieve coins, it was less about theft and more about revenge against a corrupt system that had bled them dry. Next came the slot machines. Furious mobs stormed into corner bodegas, cafes and bars, dragging the machines into the streets. They bashed them with relentless fury, reducing them to twisted metal and shattered glass, a symbolic destruction of the graft and exploitation that had defined their lives for far too long. The slot machines were smashed with clubs and sledgehammers, their insides reduced to twisted metal and shattered glass. Most were located in the casinos, so the enraged crowd split into smaller groups, making their way by car or on foot toward the grandest symbols of oppression, the hotel casinos that had propped up the Batista dictatorship for years. At the Capri, movie star George Raft was performing his usual role as the casino's celebrity greeter. On New Year's Eve, he roamed the casino floor, mingling with patrons alongside a young woman recently crowned Miss Cuba. As celebrations wound down, Raft handed her the key to his suite, promising to join her soon. By the time Raft returned, she was already waiting. There she was, asleep in my bed, Raft later recalled, but she opened one eye when I came in, half awake and amorous. "Feliz Año Nuevo," I said, sliding between the silk sheets. Their moment was shattered by the staccato of machine gun fire and booming explosions that shook the walls. Raft bolted upright and grabbed the phone. "This is Mr. Raft," he said urgently. "What's going on?" The operator's panicked voice crackled back. "Mr. Raft, the revolution is here. Fidel Castro has taken over. Batista has fled." Throwing on clothes, Raft rushed downstairs, leaving Miss Cuba behind. The hotel lobby was chaos. Employees screamed, "Bandits are coming! Hide everything!" People scattered in every direction. "I realized no one's in charge except maybe me," Raft recalled. He peered outside. Soldiers fired weapons, civilians hurled rocks, and teenagers armed with makeshift weapons approached the Capri. A mob of over 100 rebels stormed the hotel, spraying machine gun fire into the casino bar, shattering glass and splintering wood. Thinking fast, Raft climbed onto a table and shouted, "Calm down! For Christ's sake, calm down!" A fierce young woman pointed and shouted in English, "It's George Raft, the movie star!" Recognizing him, the mob froze. Seizing the moment, Raft improvised the performance of his life. "I didn't have a script," he later reflected, but I managed some kind of speech about being an American citizen and neutral. If they cooperated, they could have food and supplies. Amazingly, it worked. The rebels calmed down, did some minor looting, and dispersed. The Capri was spared, at least for that night. Elsewhere, other holdings of the Havana mob were not so fortunate. The revolution had arrived, and it showed no mercy. The casino that suffered the worst vandalism was the Plaza, the very place where Lansky had dined earlier that night with his mistress and driver. Slot machines and gambling equipment were dragged out of the Plaza casino and hurled into the street, where they were tossed atop smouldering bonfires. A similar scene unfolded at the Sans Souci, where parts of the grand establishment were doused with kerosene and set ablaze. At the Deauville, the front windows of the hotel were shattered as the mob attempted to storm the casino with malicious intent. The Sevilla Biltmore fared no better. Its casino was utterly destroyed. Amleto Battisti, its owner, sought refuge at the Uruguayan embassy, which, like many embassies in Havana, was guarded by heavily armed soldiers. The greatest indignity, however, was reserved for the Riviera. In an act of symbolic defiance, campesinos brought a truckload of pigs into the city and released them into the hotel and casino. The pigs squealed, tracked mud across the pristine floors, and defiled Lansky's pride and joy, one of the most famous mob-run gambling emporiums in the world. For some, the rage against the casinos came as a surprise. Batista was hated by many, but not everyone connected the dictator to Havana's sprawling gambling empire. Many preferred the illusion that the city's commercial development was separate from the repression and inequality festering across the island. But as the revolution progressed, this disparity built like pressure within a seething volcano. There were countless reasons to despise Batista: his shameless coup, violent repression, censorship, corruption, and cozy ties with gangsters and embezzlers. In the end, the hotel casinos became symbols of all these grievances. Emotionally, the revolutionaries, and ultimately the Cuban people, equated the Havana mob with everything they loathed about the Batista regime. Their wrath erupted with a savagery reserved for the most despised figures in society. Death to Batista, death to the collaborators, death to the American gangsters, the people shouted. Meanwhile, at 9 o'clock in the evening of the 1st of January, armed men gathered in a dimly lit room. Guns lay scattered across tabletops, floors, shoulder holsters, and the waistbands of well-fed American mobsters and their bodyguards. Armando Jaime kept his .45 caliber pistol tucked into the small of his back, ready for action. The day of destruction had left Havana scarred, but by nightfall the chaos had transformed into something more calculated. Looting had ceased, but massive demonstrations surged through the streets, more organized and determined than before. Huge waves of people marched under the black and red flags of the 26th of July movement. Armed revolutionaries patrolled the city in commandeered cars, asserting control. Those associated with the Batista regime barricaded themselves behind closed doors or fled into hiding. A mass exodus of Batistianos and tourists from the island was inevitable. The mobsters gathered at Joe Stassi's mansion in Miramar, a lavish estate surrounded by palm trees and overlooking the Almendares River. Stassi was there, along with Lansky, Trafficante, Norman Rothman, and Charles White. Others came and went throughout the tense meeting. Stacks of cash towered in the living room, piled high on tables and divided into precise denominations. The mobsters worked methodically, distributing the money among themselves. Jaime couldn't fathom how much cash was there, but estimated it to be in the millions. Joe Stassi, dressed in a short-sleeved shirt, seemed on edge, sweating profusely despite the cool evening air. Lansky, ever the picture of composure, quietly filled a small suitcase with neat stacks of $1,000 bills. Jaime watched without attempting to count the cash. It was simply too much. Days later, While driving Lansky to Rancho Boyeros Airport for his departure, the mob boss finally spoke of the suitcase. "There's several $1 million in there," Lansky remarked calmly. It was a fortune destined to vanish into the murky depths of an uncertain future. Through the first week of January, the revolutionaries celebrated triumphantly, while the mobsters scrambled to assess their uncertain futures. For now, the casinos remained closed, though some of the nightclubs still operated in a limited capacity. Fidel Castro had yet to reach Havana, embarking instead on a victory march across the island, stopping in cities and small towns to rally support and solidify his image as the people's savior. Meanwhile, American government personnel, tourists, and well-connected Cubans flooded the airports and cruise terminals, desperate to leave the island. Wayne S. Smith, a young United States consular officer stationed in Havana since the previous summer, recalled the chaos. "There were more people wanting to leave than there were seats on the planes and boats," he recounted years later. "If you were in any way connected to the Batista government, there was a sense of urgency about getting off the island." Among those escaping was Cynthia Schwartz, Lansky's 8-year-old granddaughter, who left with her grandmother Teddy, Meyer Lansky's wife. As they departed the Foxa building where they had lived, Cynthia noticed armed soldiers in green khaki uniforms patrolling the streets. Many people were leaving, and there was a great deal of turmoil, she later remembered. "We had been warned. It was time to go." Ralph Rubio, who had recently relocated with his family to Playa Estes near East Havana's beaches, packed hurriedly and fled. Like many other casino employees, he feared that his visible association with the Batista regime marked him for retaliation. Those closest to the dictator received advance warnings. Interior Minister Santiago Rey, known by Armando Jaime as Batista's lapdog, fled with the president. Eduardo Suarez Rivas, whose ties to the Cuban underworld stretched back to the days of Lucky Luciano, secured passage on a private flight, though he was forced to abandon $780,000 in a seized bank account. Lieutenant Colonel Esteban Ventura's home was vandalized by a raging mob, though he also managed to escape by plane. Not everyone was so fortunate. Rolando Masferra, notorious for his violent enforcers, Los Tigres, received no such courtesy. Forced into hiding for days, he eventually secured passage by boat to Miami. Meyer Lansky, however, chose to stay. Driven by curiosity and a gambler's instinct, he waited until Castro's triumphant entrance into Havana on the 8th of January. Castro's numerous interviews during his march across the island likely drew Lansky's attention as he sought clues about the new government's stance on casinos. Castro remained ambiguous on the matter, focusing instead on reassuring the Cuban people that the 26th of July movement was in charge and promising a new era of peace and prosperity. There may have been another reason for the lack of panic: Santo Traficante's covert relationship with Raúl Castro, Fidel Castro's brother. Trafficante had been channeling money and resources to Castro, betting that once Castro seized control of Havana, they could collaborate and form a new government. During the House Select Committee hearings, Trafficante even admitted to meeting and speaking with Raúl Castro. Meyer Lansky, deeply connected in similar circles, was also aware of influential figures within Fidel Castro's inner circle. In the late 1950s, he approached U.S. naval intelligence with a daring proposal: assassinate Castro. The agency, however, rejected the idea outright. For Lansky and Trafficante, the situation became a high-stake waiting game. They hoped that playing both sides, a strategy that had earned them vast fortunes in the U.S., would succeed again. But under Castro's unpredictable and increasingly volatile regime, nothing was guaranteed. As Castro marched across Cuba, his stops along the way were far from random. He deliberately targeted prisons, freeing captured rebels, political activists, and innocent civilians who had suffered brutal treatment under Batista's rule. These acts of defiance strengthened his support and deepened his resolve. Years of guerrilla warfare constant danger, and repeated assassination attempts had hardened Castro into a resilient and formidable leader, one the mob had dangerously underestimated. When Castro and his caravan finally reached Havana, the crowds lining the Malecón were staggering in number. Addressing the jubilant masses, Castro declared, "The people won this war. I say that just in case some individual believes he won it, or some troops believe that they won it. Before anything, there is the people." Later, at Camp Columbia, the military stronghold, Castro sought to reassure the army that he considered them allies rather than enemies. It was there that a legendary moment of revolutionary theater unfolded. As Castro stood on a platform before a sea of jubilant supporters, 2 white doves were released by a member of the 26th of July movement. In a moment laden with symbolism, one of the doves circled before landing gently on Castro's shoulder as he spoke. The stunned crowd erupted into cheers. In that electrifying moment, Castro transcended from being a revolutionary leader to a near-mythic, Christ-like figure. But the euphoria would not last. Castro's saintly image did not extend to notions of unconditional forgiveness. The executions began almost immediately. The first to face the firing squads at La Cabaña fortress were Batista's worst torturers, executioners, and informants, those considered the most brutal symbols of the old regime. Anyone accused of counter-revolutionary activity faced swift and often deadly retribution. The executions, carried out without formal trials, drew sharp criticism from the United States and the international community. Yet within Cuba, they served as a grim but powerful statement. The revolution was absolute, and its enemies would find neither mercy nor escape. Wasn't the 26th of July movement now engaging in the same kind of blood vengeance that had defined the previous regime? Castro not only defended the people's right to exact revenge on their enemies and oppressors, but he also became visibly agitated whenever the issue was raised. Standing in the massive lobby of the Havana Hilton Hotel, which the revolutionary leadership had commandeered as their new headquarters, Castro was asked by a reporter if he feared that the United States might intervene militarily. His response was chilling. "If the United States Army attempts to invade the island, there will be 200,000 dead gringos in the streets of Cuba's cities." Though he later apologized for the intemperate remark, the damage had already been done. For anyone even remotely connected to the deposed regime, a mood of paranoia took hold. Few had more reason to be concerned than the American mobsters who operated the casinos. In a statement that quickly circulated in both Cuba and the United States, Castro declared, "We are not only disposed to deport the gangsters but to shoot them." Initially, the mobsters dismissed Castro's bluster as political theater. Lansky, Trafficante, and the others wanted it known that they had not fled Cuba in fear, contrary to sensational newspaper reports. The New York Daily News claimed that the gamblers had taken their cue from their benefactor and protector, President Fulgencio Batista, and escaped the country aboard 3 chartered planes. The headlines exploded across newspapers during the first week of January. Meyer Lansky was stunned. He hadn't fled Cuba yet, and he saw no immediate reason to. But the press painted a far more chaotic picture, warning of a brewing storm headed toward U.S. shores. Nearly 200 of the city's top detectives fanned out across every rail, air, and bus terminal, their eyes sharp and nerves tense, awaiting the expected flood of Havana's gambling elite. The collapse of President Fulgencio Batista's regime had triggered a mass exodus of mobsters tied to Cuba's luxurious casino empire. Batista's secret pact with the gambling syndicate had transformed Cuba into a lavish playground, with sprawling casinos embedded in Havana's finest hotels, a key artery pumping dirty money into the Cuban economy. But Fidel Castro and his rebel army had vowed to crush the mob's empire, branding the casino's symbols of corruption and exploitation. The revolt in Cuba erupted into full-blown chaos. Sensing that Batista's days were numbered, the mobsters bolted from the island aboard 3 chartered planes. Batista's sudden escape had blindsided even his most trusted allies, and the underworld figures he protected were left scrambling. Word trickled down from a top criminal agency, most likely the FBI, that the mobsters were caught off guard. Batista's abrupt flight triggered a frantic retreat. They grabbed only the essentials: cash, clothes, wives, and mistresses. Anything else was collateral damage. By Thursday afternoon, the planes roared off the Havana tarmac, bound for New York with a brief layover in Jacksonville, Florida. Inside those cabins sat some of the most infamous names in organized crime. Leading the charge was Santo Trafficante, alias Luis Santos, the cold-blooded operator of the San Souci Hotel's gambling empire. Close behind him was Joseph Silesi, alias Joe, a notorious mob figure with a rap sheet longer than a Havana summer. Chief of Detectives James B. Leggett wasted no time. He unleashed waves of detectives from the Criminal Investigation Bureau, the Bureau of Special Services, and the Safe and Loft Squad. They swarmed airports, train stations, bus terminals, and every smoky backroom and mobster hangout in the city. The message was clear. If the mob thought they could slip into the US unnoticed, they had another thing coming. Detectives maintained a sharp watch, monitoring all possible entry points in and around the city, anticipating the arrival of Havana's notorious gambling fraternity. The sudden shift in power had left the underworld's elite stunned and desperate. Among the notorious figures expected were Santo Trafficante, the boss who controlled operations at the San Souci Hotel, and Joseph Stasi, both known for running multi-million-dollar rackets under Batista's protection. Leggett's detectives, veterans of the Criminal Investigation Bureau, the Bureau of Special Services, and the Safe and Loft Squad, were stationed at key transit hubs and known mob hangouts, ready to intercept any fleeing gangsters. The hunt was on, and no one was getting a free pass back into the States without facing the law. Meyer Lansky couldn't believe his eyes as he scanned the article. His face prominently featured alongside notorious Mafia boss Santo Trafficante. Determined to set the record straight, Lansky's representatives swiftly contacted the United States Embassy in Havana, emphatically denying that the casino mogul had fled the scene. "He is at the Hotel Riviera, taking care of personnel there, even though he is very sick and should be in the hospital," the spokesperson explained. Santo Trafficante was equally defiant. In a phone conversation with his attorney, he scoffed at the idea of leaving Cuba. "Castro is a complete nut," he fumed. "He's not going to be in power or office for long. Either Batista will return, or someone else will replace this guy, because there's no way the economy can continue without tourists, and this guy is closing all the hotels and casinos. This is a temporary storm. It'll blow over." Castro, however, was deadly serious. He shut down the casinos, cancelled the national lottery, and declared that cleaning up vice, corruption, and gambling would be among the highest priorities of his new government. Yet within weeks he was forced to reconsider. The Sindicato Gastronomico, a powerful union, complained bitterly that his anti-casino decree was costing its members 600 jobs. Economic advisors warned Fidel that without the casinos, Cuba's fragile economy would collapse. Reluctantly, Castro relented. He appointed Frank Sturgis, better known within the 26th of July movement as Frank Fiorini, as the government's liaison to the casino industry. At 34 years of age, Sturgis was a United States-born Second World War veteran and former nightclub manager from Virginia Beach who had reinvented himself as a soldier of fortune. Between late 1957 and 1958, Sturgis smuggled arms to the Sierra Maestra from the United States, Mexico, and various points across South America. On the 30th of July 1958, he was arrested in the United States on illegal gun possession charges, but was released due to lack of evidence. For his services as an arms supplier, Sturgis was rewarded with the title of Chief Inspector of Gambling Casinos. Sturgis, however, knew nothing about running casinos, a fact he freely admitted to Lansky, Trafficante, and anyone else who would listen. Though the casinos eventually reopened, the paranoid and vengeful atmosphere in Havana made it impossible for the tourist industry to recover. The rebels eventually vacated the Havana Hilton, soon renamed the Havana Libre, but the hotel operated at less than half capacity. Meanwhile, the Riviera suffered crippling losses. The Mafia did everything in their power to help stabilize the Cuban economy. They marketed their efforts wherever and however they could, even going so far as to have small, low-flying planes tow banners above Miami, advertising cheap vacations and reminding the public that the casinos in Havana had reopened. On March 2, 1959, they used this tactic to spread the word far and wide. The article that followed detailed the developments. A low-flying sports plane towed a banner over Miami, targeting beachgoers and enticing them with the message, "Casinos reopen in Havana." In a surprising reversal from his purification campaign, Prime Minister Fidel Castro had restored legal gambling, bringing back the glitter and glamour of Havana's casino scene. Brocade draperies, deep carpets, dice rolling, and wheels spinning. Behind the scenes, however, the same US mobsters who had run the show under Batista were pulling the strings once again. Castro's decision was spurred by a downturn in the tourist trade and the demands of over 2,000 workers, card dealers, croupiers, cashiers, musicians, barmen, waiters, and entertainers, who had been cast aside by the revolution. Señorita Pastora Núñez, the director of the National Savings and Housing Institute, formerly the government lottery, met with the casino owners and found them willing to meet her demand for 7 weeks of back pay for all employees. "I highly disapprove of the way you make a living," she said, "but we are reconsidering our earlier decision." The decree reopened all the major casinos, including those at the Hilton, Nacional, Riviera, Capri, Comodoro, and St. John's hotels, as well as the Tropicana, Sans Souci, and Montmartre nightclubs. Initially, the government had planned to bar Cubans from playing unless they could prove their wealth with a certificate from the Internal Revenue Bureau. However, that requirement was soon dropped, though 5 casinos, frequented by mostly Cuban patrons, remained locked up. Slot machines were also banned, for the time being. With a quiet smile, the gamblers slipped fresh boutonnieres into their black silk lapels and began the games once again, albeit for a modest crowd on the day the decree was issued. Florida mobster Santo Trafficante Jr., who had attended the infamous 1957 Appalachian Gangland Congress, was still in charge at the Comodoro and Sans Souci. He also kept an eye on the Capri Casino, where his associate, Charles the Blade Turin, ran the operation. At the Hilton, casino manager Joseph Silesi wanted in connection with the New York barbershop murder of top mobster Albert Anastasia, oversaw the games. And none of these moves were made without the consultation of Meyer Lansky, the 57-year-old gangland boss of the southeastern US, and the chairman of the Havana casino operations. Pastora Núñez warned that the current licenses, valid for only 60 days, would not be renewed for mob-run casinos. The mobsters hoped that a fresh batch of clean front men could pass the government's inspection. As one operator put it, "Only gamblers can run casinos. You can't get a priest or a garage mechanic." The mob, however, seemed content to be working with a government that prided itself on purity. One casino operator summed it up, I'm glad that those greedy Batista crooks got bounced." Between December 1958 and April 1959, accountants reported operating losses of $750,000. Within months, all the major hotels and casinos were drowning in debt. For Castro and his revolutionary government, the failure of the casinos became a political weapon. A Cuban bank, now under the direct control of the new Minister of Finance, Che Guevara, accused the casinos of skimming revenues and assumed full responsibility for counting the gambling proceeds. "Rebels in the counting rooms," Lansky reportedly fumed. It was too much for the mobsters to bear. As the casinos continued to hemorrhage money, Castro's government escalated its crackdown, rounding up many casino operators and placing them under arrest, tightening its grip on Cuba's shattered gambling empire. Among the most prominent mobsters incarcerated by Castro's government was Santo Trafficante. The Tampa mob boss had consistently underestimated the revolution's intensity. In the chaotic months following Batista's fall and Fidel Castro's rise to power, Trafficante attempted to operate as if nothing had changed. Years later, Trafficante reflected on this turbulent period during testimony before the 1978 House Committee on Assassinations. The Credit Committee chairman leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with measured intensity as he fixed his gaze on Santo Trafficante. When Fidel Castro took over, how soon did he order the casinos to be closed? He asked, his tone sharp, cutting through the stillness of the hearing room. Trafficante met the chairman's stare with practiced calm, his face unreadable. Well, he began slowly, even before he reached Havana, because he didn't come down from the mountains until after Batista had left. He had a walkathon, you could call it, from the mountains to Havana. And they kept interviewing him, and he kept saying that the casinos would close. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of something darker memories, of a time when everything unraveled. Everything was in turmoil, Trafficante continued, his words deliberate. There were people all over the streets, breaking into homes. There was complete enmity, and the only thing at that time was to try and stay alive. The chairman scribbled a note, his brow furrowing as he pressed forward. Did a time come when you were detained or imprisoned in Cuba? He asked. Trafficante's expression hardened, though his voice remained even. Yes. The chairman didn't blink. Can you tell us when that was? Trafficante exhaled slowly, his gaze distant, as though sifting through buried memories. I cannot tell you the exact date, he admitted. I got news that Cuban officials were looking for me to put me in jail, because one of the things was that I was a Batista collaborator. His tone shifted, growing colder. They raided my apartment. They were looking for money. They tore up all the furniture. They used to come and get me at night time, take me out into the woods, trying to get me to tell where I had my money, this and that, until I finally went into hiding. He paused, his eyes narrowing. And they kept on. I mean, these were a bunch of... Most of them were 15, 16, 17 years old. They had weapons. It was a bad time to be around. The room fell silent, weighted with his words. Trafficante's arrest finally came on the 8th of June, a grim footnote in the tangled history of revolution and survival. He was taken from his Vedado apartment and incarcerated at Triscornia detention camp, the same facility where Charlie Luciano had been held while awaiting deportation 12 years earlier. However, when Lucky Luciano was staying in Havana, General Batista was still firmly in control, allowing Meyer Lansky to flex his considerable influence. Under Lansky's protection, Luciano was treated like royalty, a prince of the underworld, basking in the luxury of a paradise on the brink of collapse. But for others, including Santo Trafficante, things were far less forgiving. Trafficante, along with figures like John Martino, a casino operative who was mentioned in the 1953 Saturday Evening Post article, and Loran Hall, a mercenary as well as a weapons trafficker, found themselves caught in a web of suspicion and danger. They could hear the sharp cracks of gunfire echoing through the streets, a grim metronome marking the executions of Batista loyalists. Anyone with ties to Batista's fallen regime was being hunted down with ruthless efficiency. Cuban intelligence operatives, military officers, and anyone suspected of collaboration faced the same brutal fate. The revolution showed no mercy. Those who made the fatal mistake of staying behind were now targets in a blood-soaked purge, stalked and slaughtered in the shadows of a city still seething with revolutionary fervor. The Havana mob's journey had come full circle, from outcasts to ultimate insiders, and now outcasts once again. Trafficante was not alone at Triscornia. The Cuban government concluded that if the mobsters could no longer generate profits in the casinos, they were of no use. The authorities rounded them up. Trafficante, Jake Lansky, Dino Cellini, and John Martino, the gambling manager at the Deauville, were labeled undesirable aliens and imprisoned. When the arrests began, Meyer Lansky knew his time in Cuba was up. He had become too public, too notorious, and Fidel Castro's regime would inevitably single him out. Wasting no time, Lansky turned to trusted allies Russell Bufalino and Jimmy Blue Eyes Allo, urgently orchestrating their escape from the island. Castro's men were already closing in, tightening their grip on every exit route. With airports firmly under military control, flying out was impossible. Their only hope lay in the sea. Racing against time, Lansky activated a long-standing Cuban contact who secured them passage aboard a small boat bound for freedom. It wasn't as simple as packing up and leaving when Meyer Lansky realized his time in Havana was up. Castro's men were closing in, hunting down anyone linked to Batista's corrupt empire. Lansky had hoped to make a clean getaway, but revolution had no patience for last-minute exits. He was meeting with Jimmy Blue Eyes Allo and Russell Bufalino, quietly dividing the final haul from the casino operations, a staggering $350,000 in cash. But even mob royalty couldn't smuggle that much money out of the country unnoticed. Forced to abandon the bulk of the fortune, Bufalino left the cash in the hands of trusted Cuban operatives, hoping to retrieve it later. It was a fatal miscalculation. Word spread fast in the underworld, and greed has its own way of rewriting loyalties. Two of Bufalino's Cuban contacts allegedly stole the money, an unforgivable betrayal. They didn't live long enough to enjoy a dime. Their bodies were discovered days later, silenced by bullets and left as a grim message to anyone thinking about double-crossing the Mafia. Time magazine would later report on the incident in the months leading up to Jimmy Hoffa's mysterious disappearance, suggesting a shadowy intersection of organized crime and covert U.S. operations. The CIA was already watching Bufalino's every move and knew about the fortune he left behind. They had their own designs for the cash, hoping it could be funneled into anti-Castro uprisings to destabilize the communist regime. But Havana was a war zone, and escape was the only option. As Lansky prepared to flee, Castro's men closed in, guns drawn. One of Lansky's guards fell under a hail of gunfire, his body crumpling in the dirt. Another bodyguard, acting on pure survival instinct, returned fire, forcing the revolutionaries to dive for cover. The split-second response bought just enough time. Lansky and his crew raced to a waiting car, tires screeching as they sped toward the docks. Every second counted. With revolutionaries on their heels and no guarantee of survival, they barely managed to reach the waterfront. Scrambling aboard a waiting boat, they vanished into the dark waters, leaving behind a country in flames and a fortune forever lost to the shifting tides of history. Tension hung thick in the salty night air as the vessel cut through the dark waters. In an attempt to break the silence, Jimmy Blue Eyes leaned toward Bufalino and, with a wry smile, proposed a bet. Quit smoking for a month. Never one to back down, Bufalino took the wager, and then some. He not only quit smoking for that month, but for the rest of his life, forbidding anyone, including his own wife, from lighting up in his presence. Joe Stassi was still in Havana. On the night Trafficante, Jake Lansky, and the others were arrested, Stassi called the Capri. The casino manager warned him, "Joe, don't come down here. They just pinched everybody." Stassi had been arrested several times since Castro's takeover, but had always been released. However, the arrests of Santo and Jake signaled that the authorities were serious. Realizing the peril, Stasi went into hiding and eventually fled Cuba in late 1959. Stasi's son, Joe Jr., was less fortunate. Having married into a family closely associated with the Batista regime, he faced constant harassment. Despite being repeatedly arrested, he stubbornly remained in Havana with his wife and newborn child, hoping to rebuild a career in the casino business. The new government had other plans. After spending a total of 112 days in jail, he abandoned his ambitions and left the island in 1961. Trafficante was not so lucky. He endured the harshest treatment of all. On the day of his arrest, his attorney, Frank Regano, received a call at his Tampa office. It was Trafficante, informing him that the Cuban government appeared determined not to release him this time. "It's not exactly a jail," Trafficante described his cell at Triscornia. "It's a big house across the bay from the Malecon, and I've been ordered to stay here until a decision on my case is made." "Are you all right?" Regano asked. "I can hear them shooting Batista people down the road, but I'll be okay." Trafficante's biggest concern was his eldest daughter's upcoming wedding, scheduled to take place at the Havana Hilton on Father's Day, the 21st of June. Despite the escalating danger, his daughter remained determined to proceed with the wedding, with her father in attendance. As the wedding date approached, it was uncertain whether the Cuban government would permit Trafficante to attend his daughter's ceremony. Somehow, his wife, Josephine, managed to get a personal message through to Fidel Castro, who authorized a brief furlough for the mob boss to participate in the event. Frank Regano, Trafficante's attorney, flew in for the wedding. Trafficante presided over the ceremony at the Havana Hilton, wearing a white dinner jacket and black bow tie. About 200 guests gathered in the reception room, watched closely by more than a dozen armed soldiers stationed along the perimeter. Immediately after the ceremony, Trafficante was taken back into custody and returned to Triscornia detention camp. During his brief stay in Havana, Regano noticed a stark change from his previous visits. The once vibrant, carefree atmosphere had been replaced by a grim, militarized existence. Bearded sentries barely out of their teens patrolled the streets on foot or in screeching armored cars. "I stayed at Lansky's Riviera, a virtual ghost hotel," Regano recalled. "I could hear the echoes of my footsteps on the marble floors of the vacant lobby." By early August, Jake Lansky and Dino Cellini had been released and had fled Cuba. Louis McWillie, once a pit boss, moved up to casino manager at the Tropicana and later at the Capri. Trafficante, however, remained imprisoned. In a panic, he called Regano, exclaiming, "They're going to execute me. I'm on the damn list." Desperate, he begged his attorney to fly to Havana and negotiate for his freedom. Regano returned to Cuba and began arduous negotiations with Cuban bureaucrats. He was told, in the first place, Trafficante was a Batista supporter, and Batista made life miserable for the Cuban people, except for the rich. Furthermore, Mr. Trafficante is a drug trafficker, and there is no room for drug traffickers under the new government. When Regano pressed for evidence of drug trafficking, a bureaucrat responded, "Because of the name he uses, Trafficante, one who traffics in illegal drugs. That's what the name means in Spanish." Regano countered that Trafficante was Santo's real surname, and that he had never been charged with drug trafficking in the United States or anywhere else. "If you're going to judge him by his name," Regano argued, "then he's a saint, since Santo means saint in Italian." At that moment in time, Santo Trafficante's life hung by a thread. The Mafia's top brass back in the United States was seething, blaming him for the debacle in Cuba that led to Fidel Castro's rise to power. His deep ties to Batista's fallen regime, his control over lucrative bolita rackets, and his role as a narco-trafficker painted a target squarely on his back. The mob wanted answers, and they wanted them directly from Trafficante. His release from a Cuban prison became a top priority. Behind closed doors, powerful underworld figures mobilized. Russell Bufalino, Carlos Marcello, Carlo Gambino, Vito Genovese, Joe Stasi, and the Chicago outfit pooled their resources, while Trafficante's family worked furiously to arrange his freedom. They knew Castro's regime, though ideologically driven, was still new and corruptible. In those early chaotic months, money could grease the right palms. The question was how much and how fast. Among the few daring or reckless enough to travel back and forth to Cuba at the time was Jack Ruby, who already established links with Castro and his people through weapons trafficking. His presence in Havana coincided with Trafficante's imprisonment, a fact later confirmed by the House Select Committee on Assassinations and Ruby's own statements. Ruby's sister corroborated his trips, while eyewitnesses placed him visiting the same Cuban prison where Trafficante was held. A BBC journalist detained alongside Trafficante later revealed the shocking truth. Jack Ruby was seen negotiating with Cuban officials, likely securing Trafficante's eventual release. The timing was exact, down to the day. Ruby, it seems, managed to get the cash into the right hands, convincing Castro's inner circle to look the other way, at least long enough for Trafficante to slip through the cracks. Whether through bribery, coercion, or sheer desperation, Trafficante finally secured a meeting with Raúl Castro, Cuba's formidable Minister of Defense. The encounter was tense but decisive. Raúl reportedly played a pivotal role in Trafficante's release, but not without extracting a heavy promise of good behavior. Santo lied through Ruby. He delivered the cash and managed to escape. Years later, during the 1978 House Committee on Assassinations hearings, Trafficante reflected on the strange meeting. "I think he helped," he admitted when asked about Raúl Castro's role. He recalled running into Raúl again at Havana's Hilton Hotel. "A friend told me if I wanted to thank him, Raúl was upstairs in some public lounge. I went up there and saw him coming down the stairs. My friend called out and Raúl stopped. I thanked him and he told me, 'Just behave yourself and don't let anyone shake you down. Behave and you'll be all right.'" By October 1959, Santo Trafficante Jr. was gone, forever leaving behind the blood-soaked streets of revolutionary Havana, a fortune lost in the chaos, and a past he could never truly escape. In March of the following year, Meyer Lansky made one final trip to Havana, settling into his familiar suite at the Hotel Nacional. Determined to salvage his casino empire, or at the very least track down his mistress Carmen, he hoped to help her escape the island and resettle in Miami or New York. But Carmen was nowhere to be found. She had vacated her apartment on the Prado, and no one seemed to know where she had gone, or if she was even still in Cuba. It became clear to Lansky that the mob's prospects in Cuba were finished. By this time, political executions at La Cabaña fortress had reached a chilling pace, 2 or 3 every day, with an estimated 300 victims in the first 2 months of Fidel Castro's rule. To Lansky, the new Cuban government felt eerily familiar, reminiscent of the totalitarian regimes that had driven his family out of Russia decades earlier. As he sat with his head in his hands, he realized the communists and Russians, figures who had haunted his childhood since the pogroms in Poland, had come to reclaim a part of his empire. Now, standing in the ruins of what was once his, Lansky saw before him the crumbling remnants of his power. He wasn't the young boy from Poland anymore, helpless and displaced. He was one of the most powerful and ruthless mob bosses in the world. And though the days ahead were grim, Lansky knew this truth. Organized crime no longer just had the power to make governments. It had the contacts and the know-how to break them. He shared his grim assessment with Armando, his personal driver, who surprised Lansky by choosing to remain in Cuba. "When he invited me to leave the country," Jaime recalled, "he said this revolution was a communist revolution. I told him it wasn't. It was a Fidelista revolution. I said, "I am in this revolution because it is Fidelista." Lansky struggled to accept Jaime's decision to stay. He seemed to take it as a personal betrayal. After all, for most of his life, Lansky had lived in pursuit of bourgeois respectability. He dressed and acted with an air of class and breeding, even though he and his fellow mobsters came from society's lower rungs. As the top figure in the Havana mob, Meyer Lansky built a world catering to the well-dressed and well-fed. His entire existence revolved around creating the illusion of a never-ending party, champagne flowing, orchestras playing, and elegant women draped in silk and jewels. It was a vision shared by his most powerful partner, President Batista. The revolutionaries, Castro and his followers, represented everything the Havana mob despised. Bearded, unwashed, intellectual, and fanatically doctrinaire, they were a direct affront to Lansky's empire. They tracked mud across the pristine carpets of the Hilton, Tropicana, Riviera, and other mob-owned treasures in Havana. It was a clash of cultures that could never be reconciled. "The problem," Lansky told his driver one afternoon, "is that you don't really know who I am." They were sitting on a bench in the lush gardens of the Hotel Nacional, surrounded by palm trees and vibrant bougainvillea. "I know you are Meyer Lansky," Jaime replied. "My boss, my teacher, and an American citizen." "No," Lansky corrected. "I am not American. I am from a small town that has been fought over by Poland and Russia. More than anything, I'm a Jew, a Russian Jew. And I left Russia during a revolution when I was 12.5 years old, when the communists triumphed. I know a communist revolution when I see one. And this is a communist revolution." "Well," Jaime said, "if it is as you say, then perhaps it is for the benefit of the people." "Yes," Lansky admitted, "but what about your livelihood? If they close the casinos for good, you will be out of work." Jaime shrugged. "You've been more than a boss to me. You've been a mentor. But I am staying here in Cuba." The two men said their goodbyes. They never saw each other again. Lansky remained in Havana for less than a month. He flew first to Miami, then to New York, keeping a close eye on Cuba from afar. Technically, he still owned the Riviera. His company, Compañía Hotelera La Riviera, remained the primary shareholder, though Lansky was officially listed only as the kitchen manager. The hotel's operators struggled to stay afloat, borrowing money from various Cuban financial institutions. Eventually, like most mob-run establishments in Havana, the Riviera was buried under a mountain of debt. In October 1960, the Gaceta Oficial de la República de Cuba announced the confiscation and nationalization of the Havana Riviera. It was the final nail in the coffin. The decree also claimed other hotel casinos and 165 United States enterprises, including Texaco, Goodyear, Kodak, and General Motors franchises. The Castro government had seized all United States holdings on the island. The vast sugar mills, the United Fruit Company plantations, and the mob's glittering casinos, all were now property of the Cuban state. It was the most audacious in a series of hostile economic maneuvers between the United States and Castro's regime. The new administration of President John F. Kennedy pressured Castro to hold elections and maintain the favorable tax breaks United States companies had enjoyed under previous regimes. On American television, Castro repeatedly promised democracy, denied any intention of holding permanent power, and pledged that elections were forthcoming. But elections were delayed again and again until it became clear there would be none. Cuba's government became increasingly authoritarian, with Fidel Castro assuming sole control over every matter of state. Revolutionary leaders who spoke out were arrested, executed, or forced into exile. Eventually, Castro proclaimed himself a Marxist, and the government adopted the slogan "Socialismo o muerte," socialism or death. 90 miles north, Kennedy needed to show strength. During his campaign, he had criticized his opponent, Richard Nixon, for being soft on Cuba. Now, as president, Kennedy imposed a harsh economic blockade, an embargo that endures to this day. For Lansky, Trafficante, and the rest of the Havana mob, the damage was irreversible. Their fortunes in Cuba were gone. None were as fortunate as Batista, who, in the final weeks before his escape, managed to ship suitcases stuffed with cash to Swiss bank accounts and secure his wealth far from Castro's grasp. It is estimated that Batista plundered Cuba for a staggering $300 million. One glaring sign of his bounty was the nearly $3 million he left behind in a safe in his office at the presidential palace. When a brigade of revolutionaries found the cash, they proudly displayed it to the press. Perhaps Batista considered it a tip. He certainly did not need it. Even more telling was the balance in a Cuban bank account that Batista had been unable to transfer before it was seized. A cool $20 million, which the new government used to stabilize the country's devastated economy. Lansky and his associates could have used that kind of money. Given the slippery nature of casino bookkeeping and the mobsters' penchant for hiding profits, it is impossible to calculate exactly how much they lost. But the figures must have been staggering. The Hotel Riviera alone had cost $14 million to build and equip, according to official records, or $18 million, based on an estimate Lansky himself later gave to friends. Of that investment, $6 million came from the Batista government under the provisions of Hotel Law 2074. A fair estimate of the Havana mob's personal stake in the hotel would be between $8 and $12 million. Before Castro's rise, the Riviera's gambling operations reportedly netted a profit of $3 million annually, and that was without factoring in the skim, which likely added millions more. In short, the Riviera's casino was practically a license to print money, and the Riviera was just one property. The Hilton, Capri, Deauville, Comodoro, Sanssouci, Tropicana, Nacional, Plaza, St. John's, Presidente, and other mob-owned establishments in Havana had all been highly profitable. The money was only part of what the mob lost. For men like Luciano, Lansky, Trafficante, Anastasia, and others with financial interests in Havana, Cuba had represented the ultimate dream, a sovereign nation infiltrated and controlled from top to bottom. In the underworld, gangsters often exaggerated claims of running cities. In Havana, the mob truly did run the place. It was an unprecedented achievement, but with such dizzying heights came an inevitable fall. Cuba became the mob's most catastrophic defeat. Blinded by faith in the brute power of American capitalism, the mobsters believed they could drown out revolutionary fervor with endless streams of cash. They thought rampant development would crush the will of the people. It didn't. The Cuban people made their choice, and the mob was driven out. Santo Trafficante never disclosed how much he lost in Cuba, though whispers in Tampa suggested he was flat broke. Others, Rothman, the Clark brothers, Black Jack McGinty, Charlie the Blade, Dino Cellini, and many more, scattered across the globe, maintaining ties to the gambling business in Las Vegas, Reno, the Bahamas, and Europe. Joe Stassi fared the worst. Penniless, he turned to heroin smuggling, a business he had avoided throughout his long career. Eventually, he was arrested on narcotics charges and spent the rest of his life behind bars. In a 1999 interview with writer and filmmaker Richard Stratton, Stassi quipped bitterly, "I haven't had an erection in 40 years, placing his last moment of vitality right around the time he was forced out of Havana." As for Lansky, his ambitions of expanding into the Dominican Republic were dashed for good in 1961 when dictator Rafael Trujillo was assassinated. 4 years later, fearing another Castro-like uprising in the Americas, the United States staged a military invasion of the island. In hindsight, It may have been a blessing in disguise for Lansky. He opened several large casinos in the Bahamas and England, but none came close to the splendor of his Havana empire. Over the years, he often reflected on what he had gained and lost in the Pearl of the Antilles. He told friends he had to abandon $17 million in cash, which narrowly missed being shipped out and distributed through Swiss accounts. But $17 million was nothing compared to the dream deferred. The vision of a mobster's paradise, stretching from Cuba across the Caribbean and beyond. The little man had gambled everything and come up empty. Years later, with the wisdom of age, he summed up the experience in 4 bitter words. I crapped out. The Mafia, the United States government, the Central Intelligence Agency, and Naval Intelligence all had one enemy in common. His name was Fidel Castro, and they all shared a singular goal: to eliminate him. Behind the scenes, a powerful group of industrialists, deeply entrenched in both the Cuban economy and the American establishment, worked tirelessly to protect their interests. One of these men was William Douglas Paulley, a political heavyweight and a wealthy businessman who had been influential during the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration. Paulley's power was such that on December 9, 1958, he secured a private meeting with Cuba's then-president, Fulgencio Batista. Paulley told Batista that he had lost the support of the American government and that his time in power was coming to an end. He suggested Batista step down and allow a new government to form, a caretaker junta that could bridge the gap between anti-Castro and anti-Batista forces, which in turn could defeat Castro. But Batista refused. He was too stubborn to accept defeat. And just weeks later, Cuba would fall to Fidel Castro's revolutionary forces. As Gaetan Fonzi points out in the last investigation, Paulley had also owned major sugar interests in Cuba, as well as Havana's bus, trolley and gas systems, and he was close to both pre-Castro Cuban rulers, President Carlos Prio and General Fulgencio Batista. Paulley was one of the dispossessed American investors in Cuba who early tried to convince Eisenhower that Castro was a communist and urged him to arm the exiles in Miami. By March 1958, President Dwight Eisenhower, disillusioned by the inefficiency and corruption of the Batista regime, demanded that elections be held. But the Cuban people had already made their decision. They boycotted the polls. In Havana, over 75% of voters stayed home, and in places like Santiago, the number was as high as 98%. This widespread dissatisfaction led some members of the U.S. State Department to conclude that America's long-term interests in Cuba would be better served by opposing Batista. William Wieland, Director of Caribbean and Central American Affairs, was one of the most vocal opponents of continued American support for the Cuban dictator. U.S. Ambassador Earl Smith would later testify before a Senate committee, revealing that Wieland believed that it would be in the best interest of Cuba and the best interest of the world in general when Batista was removed from office. Wieland wasn't alone. According to Paulley and Smith, key figures such as Roy Rubottom, Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs, John Topping, Chief of the Political Section, and the Chief of the CIA Section, all shared this view. Paulley and Smith also pointed to Herbert Matthews of the New York Times as an important voice supporting regime change in Cuba. Matthews had written 3 articles on Fidel Castro that eulogized him as a political Robin Hood, painting him as a hero to the oppressed. But on December 9, 1958, Paulley's meeting with Batista proved futile. He warned the Cuban leader that he had lost the backing of the U.S. government and should resign immediately. Batista rejected the idea, and on December 14th, William Wieland, acting on behalf of the State Department, instructed Ambassador Earl Smith to tell Batista that he no longer had America's support and should leave the island. Less than 3 weeks later, on January 1st, 1959, Batista fled to the Dominican Republic, and Castro's revolution succeeded. Paoli, however, was far from finished. In the aftermath of Batista's fall, he took his fight to Washington. Paoli pressured President Eisenhower to provide military and financial aid to the anti-Castro Cuban exiles living in the United States. Newly released FBI files suggest that Paoli worked closely with Manuel Artemay, a key figure in efforts to overthrow Castro in what would become a series of failed attempts to reclaim Cuba. Later, in a Senate Committee on Latin American Affairs, Paoli delivered a damning critique of the U.S. government's actions. "I believe that the deliberate overthrow of Batista by Wieland and Matthews, assisted by Rubottom, is almost as great a tragedy as the surrendering of China to the communists by a similar group of Department of State officials 15 or 16 years ago," he said. "And we will not see the end in the cost of American lives and American resources for these tragic errors." For Paoli, the battle was far from over. Even as the winds of revolution tore through Cuba, he remained determined to reshape the course of history. The consequences of what unfolded in Appalachian New York in 1957 were nothing short of catastrophic for the world of organized crime. It wasn't just the Vegas operations that were brought into the public eye, but the very existence of these men across America and the vast control of their criminal empires. Newspapers ran sensationalist stories, digging into their own archives to connect the dots that even law enforcement had missed. Journalists uncovered the wealth, the power, and the influence these men had amassed, piecing together a sprawling network of organized crime across the country. In fact, the press was ahead of both local police and the FBI, who had long ignored or been held back from investigating these activities by J. Edgar Hoover. Yet despite Hoover's stonewalling, the FBI had kept tabs on the most powerful figures in organized crime, including men like Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Tony Accardo, and Jake Guzik, who died in 1957, along with up-and-comers like Carlo Gambino. Gambino, for his part, wasted no time consolidating power. He brought men like Roy Cohn into his fold, men who knew the hidden truths about Hoover's own personal life, including his homosexual affairs, something Hoover was desperately keen to keep out of the public eye. For reasons that remain unclear, both Hoover and Robert F. Kennedy allowed Gambino to operate largely unchallenged. However, it was the lower-level gangsters, once aligned with Albert Anastasia, who would bear the brunt of the Justice Department's fury. But it wasn't just the Mafia figures who suffered from the shifting tides. As Cuba fell, so did the empire of Vito Genovese. His grip on power loosened, and his control over operations that spanned the globe began to unravel. Cuba, a critical source of wealth and influence for the Genovese crime family, had been a jewel in Luciano and Lansky's crown since the 1930s. When Castro's revolution toppled the Batista regime, the repercussions for organized crime were severe. The loss of Cuba hit the Trafficante and Genovese crime families hardest, both of which had deep investments in the island's criminal operations. The Genovese family, once the Luciano family, had been involved in Cuba since the 1930s, with significant ties to the Havana casino and gambling scene. The Trafficante family, led by Santo Trafficante, also relied heavily on Cuba's profits, making the island's fall a devastating blow to their operations. By the 1950s, following the Kefauver hearings and increased scrutiny on organized crime, it became nearly impossible for these families to operate openly in the United States. Unable to secure legitimate licenses or establish empires under their names, many turned to Cuba, the Dominican Republic, the Bahamas, Brazil, and even Canada, where the laws were more lenient and offered an escape from the prying eyes of U.S. authorities. As the political tides shifted and Castro's revolution took hold, these syndicates were forced to find new territories to dominate. The migration to other countries in the Caribbean and Latin America became a lifeline for the mobsters who had lost their foothold in the U.S. While some families, like the Gambinos, were less affected due to their more diversified operations. Others saw their empires crumble, setting the stage for new rivalries and power struggles in the wake of Cuba's collapse. While Anastasia had plans to invest in Cuba, his sudden death left Gambino with a freer hand, and the family quickly distanced itself from the island. The Gambinos, though, had their eyes on a much bigger prize. With Castro's rise to power, creating instability in Cuba, an opportunity arose for those with the right connections to reassert themselves. If they could help eliminate Castro, they might once again be welcomed back to the table as equal business partners, as long as they could sort out matters in New York and elsewhere. But with Cuba's instability drawing attention away from the Mafia for a brief moment, the top families, including Gambino, Luciano, and Costello, saw an opening to stabilize the New York operations. But one man stood in their way: Vito Genovese. A believer in the old vision of a boss of bosses, he saw himself as the rightful heir to the throne, much like his contemporaries, Joe Bonanno, and the former deceased boss of bosses, Salvatore Maranzano. But Genovese's ambition was too much for the others to bear. His vision of becoming the boss of all bosses was a threat to the carefully maintained balance of power in New York, and those who stood to lose the most were determined to act. In 1959, Genovese was arrested and sent to prison, and his name still echoed through the headlines. His rivals, including Costello, Luciano, Gambino, Longhi, Zwilman, and Lansky, seized the opportunity to remove him from the equation. For years, Luciano had survived multiple assassination attempts and frame-ups, and now it was Vito Genovese's turn to face the consequences of his ruthless ambition. Vito Genovese was eventually imprisoned in 1959 on a narcotics charge, which marked a significant turning point in his once dominant crime empire. Locked up in a federal prison, his ability to communicate and give orders became severely restricted. In the years prior, Genovese had placed a great deal of trust in Gerardo "Jerry" Catena, a loyal and competent member of his inner circle. Luciano had once stated that Genovese trusted Catena with everything in his life: his money, his family, his operations. Back in the 1930s, when Genovese went on the run to avoid law enforcement, he made Catena his boss, knowing he could rely on him to manage his empire in his absence. Catena proved more than capable, handling the family's affairs with efficiency and loyalty. So when Genovese found himself behind bars in 1959, it was only natural that he would appoint Catena as the acting boss of the Genovese crime family. Catena's leadership ensured the family remained intact and operational, even in Genovese's absence. His appointment solidified his position within the organization and reinforced his trustworthiness in Genovese's eyes, ensuring that the Genovese family remained a powerful force in the New York Mafia despite its leader's imprisonment. To manage the operations in Cuba and re-establish a foothold abroad, particularly in the Dominican Republic and the Bahamas, men like Joe Stassi and Russell Bufalino took up the mantle. These old-school mafiosi, trusted, well-regarded, and highly secretive, became the key figures handling critical operations for Vito Genovese. They were tasked with overseeing major activities, especially those involving arms flows and weapons trafficking, which had become crucial in the volatile situation following the Cuban Revolution. Genovese, knowing the stakes were high, relied on these men to regain some semblance of control over Cuba, which had slipped through the fingers of organized crime after Fidel Castro's rise to power. A huge sit-down was arranged, bringing together key figures like Carlos Marcello, the Chicago outfit, Santo Trafficante, Joe Stassi, Russell Bufalino, the Central Intelligence Agency, and others. The CIA and Naval Intelligence, desperate to gather information on the ground in Cuba, saw the Mafia as the perfect conduit. With Castro firmly in control, they feared the loss of all their assets and needed to keep the remaining ones alive to understand what was happening inside the island. The goal was to infiltrate Cuba and gauge the possibility of a rebel group taking action against Castro. They needed intelligence on the best locations to place these rebels, who would support them, and how to conceal their identities. This was not unlike the Mafia's previous collaboration with the Allies in the invasion of Sicily, where they provided invaluable intelligence. Now the same strategy was being applied to Cuba. The Cuban exiles fleeing the island, desperate and disillusioned, weren't always reliable sources for the American authorities, often blaming the US for the rise of Castro. But the Mafia, with their deep ties and influence within the Cuban community, could act as liaisons, facilitating the flow of information to the CIA. Through this covert collaboration, organized crime played a crucial role in gathering intelligence for the US government. Men like Russell Bufalino, Meyer Lansky, the New Orleans crime families, and the Trafficante clan worked together behind the scenes to ensure this operation succeeded, offering the CIA a lifeline in a tense and uncertain political climate. This partnership between the US government and the Mafia was a complicated web of alliances and opportunism. While the CIA sought to undermine Castro's regime, the Mafia looked to protect their business interests and reclaim lost territory. In the shadows, the underworld and the intelligence world worked together, each with their own agenda. But ultimately, their paths had converged on the common goal of toppling Castro and regaining control of Cuba. In 1960, an explosive article was published about Vito Genovese, detailing his rise to power, his fall, and his time behind bars. This led to the release of King of Crime, a book written by Tom Frasca, who had met with Genovese and gathered first-hand accounts. King of Crime would later become a rare and expensive artifact for Mafia historians, and for anyone interested in the true depths of Genovese's empire. If I ever make a documentary about Vito Genovese, it would be when I can afford to purchase this rare book in its entirety, as it offers an in-depth look at a man whose legacy loomed large over the Mafia world. The book is still difficult to find and costly, but in 1960 it created waves. As the articles about Genovese circulated, the war on organized crime continued to ramp up, and even behind bars, the story of Vito Genovese was far from over. In his foreword, author Dom Frasca's first words read, "This book is designed primarily to show how Vito Genovese, with New York as his headquarters, bosses an empire of crime with the connivance of crooked politicians." Whereupon Frasca gets right down to the core, rotten as it is, of things. Also, CA admits, in some respects it, the book, is also biography of a master criminal, but these details should be regarded merely as a necessary part of the tome's 217 pages that expose and challenge, possibly even goad, the guilty ones. Irrefutably unmasked in a comprehensive maze of details and allegations is the big O for operator of outlawry, Genovese. Frasca transmits to the reader copious and substantive copy pertinent to Genovese's life, his trials, his marriages, a dubious liaison with the United States Army as an interpreter in Italy during World War II, an interlude that leads to a post-war recital of the omnipotent and strategic political connections Vito bridged in his tottering homeland. A most appealing phenomenon that becomes manifest in King of Crime is the unending protection afforded the Mafia czar by a unique coterie of connivers. It is a league of personalities encompassing many backgrounds, figures cosily ensconced for the most part in upper social and governmental levels. By such stratagem, vice conditions as they are in this nation manage to subsist. Until this pyramid of power is toppled, no solution to the existing corruption and victimization is perceived by the author. We readers may not think the criminal doings of the so-called syndicate, this central bastion of banditry, affect us in the far reaches, so to speak. By the simple arithmetic of adding $5 in protection duty to a garment worth $20, thereby eventuating its retail value at $25, Frasca illuminates the economic tie between big city brigandage and the remainder of the nation. This example is brought home all the more markedly when it is realized that 2/3 of the clothing worn in the United States has its inception in New York's apparel center. Mobdom's pinch into labor union policymaking has cost the public a pretty penny. Here, then, is the incredible, but so terribly true, yarn of a criminal whose activities have had a frighteningly profound effect. Dubbed by no less than former New York Governor Tom Dewey as the king of the rackets, Vito Genovese has portrayed her as a man of several faces: ruthless, tyrannical, lust-ridden, family-loving, coy, cautious, even a paisan come lately of pseudo-humble bent. Through it all, nonetheless, emerges a viper of violence, a person with a predilection for evil and easy money. Since before Vito Genovese stepped off the steamship Taormina 46 years ago, at the age of 15, his thoughts and pursuits have been steeped in fury. The result of a lifetime of racketeering that has embraced all the grimy segments that honeycomb crime cells, from prostitution, gambling, bootlegging, and extortion, to murder and mayhem. By the time his father, Filippo Genovese, a struggling immigrant contractor, scraped together enough lira to send for his son, the boy had already gotten an early start in the age-old Mafia version of the squeeze play, extracting protection money from helpless Italian pushcart peddlers. Vito learned at an early age that his muscles were more than a match for the decrepit vegetable vendors whose peripatetic mode of business remains, to this day, a familiar sight along the cobblestones of Naples and other Italian cities and villages. "Give me 1 lira," Vito used to say at the ripe old age of 13, "and I will protect your business." A peddler who resisted his demands would, at the very least, be faced with the prospect of having his pushcart overturned at an unguarded moment. Thoughts of such similarly easy pickings, but on a much grander scale, dwelled in the young Vito's mind when he embarked for the promised land of America back in 1913. His hard-working father had visions of Vito joining him in honest toil. He soon learned the boy had no intention of finding his rainbow befogged by the sweat of manual labor. Finally, in desperation, he sent Vito to live with relatives in the Mulberry Street area on New York's Lower East Side, a haven for Italian immigrants. For a young man burning to get rich quickly, there were always many small jobs to be done for the mob, with the promise of advancement for the go-getter. Vito Genovese wasted little time proving he was made for the business of crime. He mastered the use of a gun to complement his strong-arm repertory. He grasped the English language with remarkable speed and chose as his friends hoodlums who would rise with him: Michelle, Mike, Miranda, Anthony, Tony Bender, Strollo, and Charles, Lucky, Luciano. Miranda is recognized as Genovese's top aide these days. He is 2 years older than Genovese and brought him into the Mafia in 1915 during a period when medieval initiation rites, complete with religious symbols and primitive bloodlettings, were administered to inductees. The oath taken by Vito Genovese was administered by Ignazio Saletta, the first Mafia boss in the United States. Saletta, known as Lupo the Wolf, owned a stable in East Harlem where 39 men of Italian birth were slaughtered, and their bodies, with tongues significantly slit, were shipped in trunks to fictitious addresses all over the country. He finally got too hot even for his own kind and retired in 1923. Vito Genovese was arrested for the first time in 1917 at the age of 19 for carrying a gun and was sent to jail for 60 days. He was arrested a second time for carrying a gun in 1925 and was fined $250. He was not convicted of a crime again until 1959, when a federal court jury found him guilty of heading a multi-million-dollar narcotics ring. Sentenced to 15 years in prison and fined $20,000, Genovese presently is free on bail pending the outcome of an appeal. By the spring of 1933, Genovese was well established in the New York underworld. At 35, he was on his way to building a sizable fortune. His subordinates in the mob started referring to him as Don Vitone, Sir Vito, about this time. Don Vitone, he still is author, Frasca insists. Genovese's bloody career is documented to the present. A top reporter for the New York Journal-American was able to penetrate Genovese's privacy on the gangster's assumption that the author would present Vito's side of the story. Frasca has done that. He also has revealed many other interesting views related to the overall plot. After this book is circulated, it behooves one to imagine how Frasca figures he will retain breathing power. It is that loaded. Nevertheless, Frasca cites dates, times, places, and acquaintances. Just about anything linking Genovese with the underworld's hierarchy. The author calls attention to Genovese's embarrassing capture at the infamous Appalachian Convention in New York in 1957. The reader will remember that conclave was supposedly a meeting for scores of upper crust hoods from across the nation to swap ideas on matters of international gambling policy. However, no disposition has been made of Vito's case. 19 of the racketeers in attendance at Appalachian on November 14, 1957, were convicted and sentenced in federal court last week. Significantly, a few months later, the murder of waterfront toughie Albert Anastasia was accomplished in a posh New York barbershop as the hated, one-time murder. Incorporated executioner was getting his hair cut and his nails trimmed. Anastasia's assassination is attributed to his attempt to move into Cuban gambling, an area reserved for another of Genovese's trusted aides, Meyer Lansky. An alliance unique in that Lansky is not of Italian descent. Also, the attempted assassination of gangster Frank Costello earlier in 1957 reportedly did not sit too well with his old buddy, Vito, either. Anastasia was believed to be the fingerman behind the botched Costello shooting. And, when Anastasia made overtures toward moving into Havana, the syndicate's board of directors voted that the master killer had to go. He went shortly thereafter. One of the more intriguing traits that lace king of crime is the parade of renowned and notorious names that crop up from time to time. Former New York City Mayor William O'Dwyer. One time, Lieutenant Governor Charles Paletti of New York. Carmine DeSapio, the acknowledged power of Tammany Hall. Labor leader Jimmy Hoffa, and countless proven labor racketeers, including Johnny Dio and Anthony, Tony Ducks, Corallo, the latter whose extensive criminal record and background in Mafia activities have not prevented him from becoming vice president of New York City Teamsters Local 239. Johnny Dio Guardi, was among the mobsters Vito Genovese invited to the Hotel Diplomat in New York City on June 24, 1946. The meeting was designed to give the Mafia, that is, the syndicate, a facelift, a look of respectability through the infiltration of legitimate business fronts. How else to do this more expediently than by permeating the ranks of organized labor? This is the thought the author conveys. At that time, Dio was a crude and vicious hoodlum, operating with a blackjack and a gun to shake down manufacturers in New York's garment center. Soon, after the Hotel Diplomat caucus of deadbeats, Dio sallied forth in Ivy League clothes, sporting carefully honed fingernails and a batch of calling cards identifying him as John Dioguardi, labor consultant. Dio was indicted in 1956 for the acid blinding of labor columnist Victor Riesel, but was never brought to trial. In 1957, he was imprisoned for 15 to 20 years as a labor extortionist. Less than 2 years later, Dio was released from prison when the appellate division, by a 4-1 decision, not only set aside his conviction, but also dismissed the indictment charging him with extortion. Denmark was not the only place where something was rotten. Shenanigans like that are what prompt author Frasca to wonder aloud about the dangers of continued collusion between gangdom and officialdom. To his and others' way of thinking, such marriages give the word union a different and unsavory interpretation. The newspapers were a battlefield of lies, manipulation, and half-truths. Stories were planted, twisted, and spun by organized crime to shift blame, bury scandals, and frame enemies. Yet no matter how many false narratives they pushed, one undeniable fact remained. The power these men wielded could no longer be hidden in the shadows. The McClellan hearings pierced that darkness, exposing corruption not just in organized crime, but also within the unions themselves. What followed was a brutal war within the ranks of the Teamsters. David Beck, the union's reigning kingpin, was a man deeply entangled with the mob. But betrayal came from within his own camp. Jimmy Hoffa, a power-hungry underboss who handed damning evidence to Robert F. Kennedy behind the committee's back. Beck's downfall was swift and absolute, paving the way for Hoffa to seize control of the Teamsters. With Hoffa now in command and the mob under relentless scrutiny, organized crime scrambled to control the narrative. They reignited Cold War fears, pointing fingers at Castro, Cuba, and communism, much like they had in the 1950s. But it was too late. Cuba was already a known mob haven, and with gangsters fleeing in every direction, newspapers churned out sensational headlines at a relentless pace. Each new article dragged a different crime family into the public eye. Robert Kennedy intensified the assault. He didn't just haul mobsters before the Senate. He summoned senators, judges, police chiefs, district attorneys, businessmen, and even victims of mob harassment. His light wasn't a spotlight. It was a burning torch, exposing every sordid detail of organized crime's grip on America. Some mob bosses, now facing retirement, had hoped to fade into obscurity. Instead, they found their darkest secrets splashed across front pages. Their empires, once impenetrable, were being dissected piece by piece. Kennedy himself underestimated the monster he faced. Only when he entered the White House did he realize how deeply organized crime's roots ran, stretching into the Central Intelligence Agency and even manipulating J. Edgar Hoover through bribes and blackmail involving personal scandals. The mob was cornered. The political tides were shifting. The anti-communist crusade of the McCarthy era was giving way to the turbulent 1960s. A decade defined by psychedelic drugs, assassinations, and global unrest. It was a world Meyer Lansky had helped shape, but now found slipping beyond his control. His criminal empire, built on brilliance and brutality, was unraveling. Many powerful men blamed Lansky for their losses and wanted his head on a platter. But his unparalleled network and deep-rooted alliances made him more valuable alive than dead. He would be forced to answer for what the mob believed he had cost them. Whether he could survive the reckoning was another matter entirely. And that is where the next chapter of Lansky's story begins.